So we talked a little bit about tissues, and I told you in the hierarchy that tissues combine to form organs. The simplest type of organs that exist are membranes. Membranes are formed from two types of tissues, two layers of tissues, the simplest combinations of tissues. There are two categories of membranes, epithelial membranes and connective tissue membranes. The difference is that epithelial membranes are formed from a layer of epithelial tissue bound to a layer of connective tissue, and the connective tissue membranes are formed from two layers of connective tissue. There are three different types of epithelial membranes: the cutaneous membrane, mucous membranes, and serous membranes. The cutaneous membrane is our skin. It is a dry membrane. It's formed from stratified squamous epithelium bound to underlying connective tissue, which is generally dense, irregular connective tissue. And we'll talk more about the skin in the next chapter. Mucous membranes are membranes that line our open body cavities, the digestive tract, the oral and anal cavities open to the exterior. The respiratory tract opens to the exterior through the nasal cavity. The urogenital tract, the reproductive tracts have mucous linings, mucous membrane linings. Mucous membranes are wet membranes. They are composed of a layer of epithelial tissue attached to a layer of connective tissue, which is called the lamina propria. The type of epithelium will vary depending on the organ that we're looking at. So in the oral cavity, the epithelium is stratified squamous, whereas in the small intestines, the epithelium is simple columnar. But they're bound to lamina propria, and they therefore make up the membrane. The mucous membrane is an epithelial membrane. This membrane produces a mucus secretion. That mucus serves different functions in different regions. It traps debris in the respiratory tract. It lubricates the flow of food going through the digestive tract. And then the serous membrane is membrane that lines the body cavities close to the exterior. So the ventral body cavity, the thoracic cavity and its subdivisions, and the abdominal pelvic cavities have serous membrane lining them. The serous membrane is a double-layered membrane. One layer lines the wall of the cavity in which it is found. The other layer doubles around and lines the organs in that cavity. So two layers. Between the two layers is a fluid that's produced. That's the serous fluid. It helps lubricate the organs in those cavities, protects them as they rub against each other, and the wall of the cavity itself. Now, the serous membrane is named based on a couple of things: where it is located and whether it is lining the wall of the cavity or the organ in the cavity. So if it's lining the wall of the cavity, we call it parietal. And if it's lining the organs in that cavity, we call it visceral. So for example, if we're talking about the serous membrane of the lungs, so that's the pleural cavity. If it's lining the wall of the cavity, it's the parietal pleural. If it's lining the lungs in the cavity, it's the visceral pleural. It's named based on where it is and what it covers. And the abdominal pelvic cavity, and the abdominal cavity, is called the peritoneum. Lining the wall is the parietal peritoneum. Lining the organs in that cavity is visceral peritoneum. Now, this membrane is composed of a simple squamous epithelium bound to areolar connective tissue. Now, those are the epithelial connective tissues. Epithelial membranes, sorry. The connective tissue membranes are formed from two different connective tissues, at least two. And examples include synovial membrane, superficial fascia, deep fascia, and dura mater. The synovial membranes are the membranes that line our joint cavities. They are the membranes that allow those joints to move freely. Those synovial membranes secrete a fluid. That synovial fluid helps lubricate the joints. Synovial membranes are composed of dense white fibrous connective tissue bound to elastic connective tissue, and adipose connective tissue. Now, the superficial fascia is formed from a layer of areolar connective tissue attached to a layer of adipose connective tissue. We find this type of membrane under the deeper layers of the skin and what is known as the hypodermis. And then deep fascia, which is deep to the superficial fascia, is formed from dense white fibrous connective tissue and elastic connective tissue. The deep fascia is the connective tissue that surrounds our muscles and our nerves as they're traveling together. And then lastly, the dura mater. Dura mater is composed of 2 layers of dense white fibrous connective tissue. This membrane surrounds the brain and spinal cord in the dorsal body cavity. Those are the membranes, epithelial and connective tissue membranes.